planning partners, welcoming you to this breakfast webinar. As most of us know, in July, there's legislation coming in that will legislate how we use spam and don't spam, and how we collect names and so on and so forth. So this is very timely, and I'm very pleased to have Lisa Kemba from Constant Contact, who's been a long-time business colleague of ours and who's an expert in this very topic, come in for this webinar and present the ins and outs of legislation and how to take advantage of it. So with no further ado, I'm going to pass the baton over to Lisa. It's all yours, Lisa.
Thanks, Nick. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Welcome, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to be with you this morning. We're here to talk about list building and the legislation, but we're also here to talk about the importance of relationships, because those names in your database, they aren't just names. They're customers, they're prospects, they are donors, members, or supporters, and they're your clients. They're the people who help make your business the organization that it is today. So I want to be clear that what we're going to be talking about today is not just about you growing your list as a simple set of tasks or tools, but I really want you to think about how every time you have an opportunity to add a name to your database, how that opportunity represents a commitment on your part, and how you then have to engage with your audience and deliver on that commitment. So what I'm going to be talking about today is why it's so important to grow your contacts. I'm going to go through a summary of the Canada anti-spam legislation. I want to talk a little bit about how you go about collecting names and some great tools that make it easy to do that. And then we're going to quickly go through some of the common questions that we get about CASL, and I will go through some next steps, what you can do to take action today to comply with the legislation. In addition to these topics, I really want to drive home the point that the objective isn't simply about growing your list to some massive size. It's about growing your business and your organization. And I think the legislation gives us a great opportunity to sort of pull up our socks around how we do that. So let's jump in and talk about what the Canada anti-spam legislation is. If any of you have been hearing about this, you hear it referred to Canada anti-spam legislation. You've probably heard it referred to as CASL, but it really is all the same thing. It's new legislation that when it takes effect on July 1st, it's going to have broad sweeping impact on all organizations that use any form of digital communication. So I want to be clear up front that it is all forms of digital communication. So it includes social media, text messaging, email marketing, of course, mobile marketing, any digital voice communication, so those automated messages that you get on your answering machine. And since most organizations will fall under this very large catch-all, it's important that everyone kind of pay attention to this legislation and figure out what pieces of it will apply to the business practices that you're using. So what is Canada anti-spam legislation? Well, it is new rules for sending commercial electronic messages. It's a standalone law that passed royal assent at the end of 2010. It's going to go into enforcement, as I said, on July 1st. I think we're all pretty aware of that. So the time to start taking action is now. As I said, it applies to any form of digital communication. For today, for the purpose of today's topic, I'm going to look primarily at email marketing. But I do want you to know and to keep in mind that there are rules in there very similar to the rules for email marketing that apply to all forms of digital communication. So what's the focus of CASL? Probably the number one focus is around consent. There's certainly a few key points that need to be considered when it comes to consent. If you're going to comply, then you need to figure out what comprises consent, what type of consent is appropriate, and who is required to get consent. The main point of the legislation is this. Don't assume that your audiences want to get your marketing materials. Get their permission first. I think that's really the basic premise of the legislation. However, there are different types of consent that are covered within the legislation, and I just want to back up for a second. Actually, as I'm talking, I'm realizing I probably should have said I am not a lawyer. I'm a marketer. So for me, my whole interest around the legislation is how can I take the legislation, which to me is a good news story, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but how can I take that legislation and apply it in the real world where we're all doing business, where we have things that we're doing to try to build our businesses, to try to communicate with our contacts, our clients, our prospects. How can we take and apply it and make it work for us in a meaningful way? So as I said, there's two types of consent that are covered in the legislation. The first is express consent. And that's the expression that is used in the legislation. Express consent is really any kind of explicit permission that you get to get people on your email list or on your list, whether it's for text messaging or whatever. But for now, I'm going to talk about email. So anything that you do that gets people to explicitly say, yes, I'm interested in receiving your messages. And that can be, there's three types of explicit or express permission. Electronic permission is probably the most preferred because then you have a digital record of when and how someone subscribed. But you can also get their permission in writing, so that would look like if you're at a trade show or something and you have someone fill out a ballot, so they're actually writing something out. They're filling out a form, and on that form it says that they're giving you permission to add them to the email list. And then you can also go and get permission orally. So when you're on the phone with people, you can just make it a habit to be asking them, are you on our email list? Could we continue sending you your messages, or could we start sending you our newsletters, whatever it is that you're going to start sending? So those three types of permission, electronic, written, and oral, are considered express consent. Now, the one thing that you do need to be clear about is that when you're requesting express consent, you need to be clear about what they're going to get from you. So they need to clearly understand that they're subscribing to your list and you're going to be sending them regular communication. Maybe you want to keep it somewhat vague, but give them some idea of what they're going to get and how frequently. You want to indicate who's requesting permission. So where this comes into play is if you're running an agency, for instance, and maybe you're making calls on behalf of your client. Maybe you're a virtual assistant and you're doing that on behalf of a client. You just need to be really clear with people what they're giving permission for. And I think that one's fairly obvious anyway. And then you also need to let people know that they do have the option to unsubscribe if they change their minds later. So those are probably the number one things to consider around express consent. The one thing that I do want to point out is when it comes to express or explicit permission, up until now, if we were collecting permission electronically, very often we had a pre-checked box on our electronic form, and it just said, yes, I want to continue receiving your email messages, and the little checkbox was already checked off. Under the guidelines of the legislation, that is no longer acceptable. So it needs to be something that they clearly go and check the box, not that's pre-checked for them. It's just a small point that does change things a little bit on our electronic form. So that is express consent, and it's pretty straightforward, I think, and it's probably a little broader than most people thought. Most of the time when I'm presenting to people about the legislation, they think that it is really only electronic permission, and they think that it requires a double opt-in, which is actually not the case. Double opt-in is considered best practice around getting permission. Double opt-in is where you enter an email address, you have the recipient enter their email address more than once, so that you're making sure that they're not mistyping or there's no typos in the email address, and getting them to reconfirm their permission that way. But a double opt-in is not required under the legislation. Still considered best practice, but not required under CASL. So that is express consent. Let's talk a little bit about implied consent. So the legislation does make concession for implied consent where there's already some kind of business relationship. There's some sort of pre-existing relationship, or the contact has published or given their email address to you. So what does this look like? Well, it can be either a business or non-business relationship. So non-business relationship might be where there's, I don't know, family members associated with the business. Nick, I just heard a big something on the line. Can you still hear me?
I can still hear you at this end.
All right. Okay, good.
Yep.
And then anywhere that there is a published electronic address, a published email address that doesn't have a disclaimer that says they do not wish to receive unsolicited messages. What might this look like? Well, I'll take myself as an example. I have a role at Constant Contact that is fairly public, so my email address is published on our website. If you want to get in touch with me in Canada East, my email address is right on the website. That would be an example where my email address is published. At the moment, there is no disclaimer there saying that I do not want to receive unsolicited messages. I'm depending on technology to filter out anybody who isn't really sending me a legitimate message. And then the third point there is just where someone has given you their email address. So that might be if you're out at a Chamber of Commerce meeting or something like that. You exchange business cards with people. If you don't specifically ask for express consent, then there is some measure of implied consent, at least under the legislation. Now again, there's a legislative issue and what's acceptable under the legislation, and then I would suggest to you that there's also best practices. And frankly, I don't think that third point is a best practice. If you haven't got permission from someone, I wouldn't suggest you be emailing them anyway, no matter what the legislation says. So just be careful about that. I think people kind of exchange business cards without expecting to start getting your newsletters. So the details of implied consent are probably not as important as this point, and that is that implied consent under the Canada anti-spam legislation has a time limit of 2 years. So in fact, it's really the worst kind of permission. And at Constant Contact, we don't even recommend it. I've been out and presented on the topic of anti-spam legislation in the last 6 months, probably 50 times. And when I'm sitting in a seminar and I'm talking to people, I would just strongly encourage you to go right away for express consent. Now that's for going forward. We'll talk about in a minute here, we'll talk about what do you do with your existing list, and how can you clean that up. But I do want you to remember that there is a time limit around implied consent. So yes, you may have a business relationship with someone today, but if you're not doing business with them in 2 years from now, then you need to take them off your email list if you don't have express consent from them. So it does create some logistical challenges. How do you track that? How can you make sure that you're, getting express consent from people who you've done business with? How can you make sure that if you don't have express consent that you're keeping track of that sort of thing in order to make sure that you remove them from your list if you aren't doing business with them anymore? So why not get the best type of relationship or best type of permission right off the bat in any business relationship or non-business relationship? Just get express consent right away.
I have a question for you here, Lisa.
Sure.
And they said, what happens when someone gives you their business card? Does that fall into one of these categories?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what I was just saying. Under the implied consent, if someone exchanges a business card with you, then yes, you have implied consent. Again, okay. It expires in 2 years. How do you keep track of it? And frankly, like I said, under the legislation, yes, it falls under implied consent. Under a good marketer's best practices, I would say it's not the best thing to do, to just get a business card from someone and start emailing them.
Yeah. Okay.
Without making sure that they want to be on your list.
Yeah.
So there's a few other things that need to be included in your emails if you want to be sure that you're maintaining compliance with the Canada anti-spam legislation. The first is that you need to include an unsubscribe option. So it really means that you either need to use some kind of email marketing system, such as Constant Contact or one of our competitors, but you do need to have some kind of a tool that lets you give people the option to unsubscribe. You could, I guess, technically remove people manually from your list, but it does become a little bit challenging as your business grows and you're busy and maybe now you've got a team working for you, and you know, they may not be careful about taking people off the list if they've asked to unsubscribe. So I strongly recommend that you use a tool. They're inexpensive, and it's so much easier. And then under the legislation, if you want to comply, if you're adding an unsubscribe option, which you have to under the legislation, that unsubscribe has to happen within 2 weeks. So it's for 10 business days. So if somebody asks to be taken off your list, you need to make sure they're off the list within 10 business days. If you use software, it happens pretty much instantaneously. The second thing is that it's under the legislation, you do need to include a reminder on why you're getting the email. Again, that's considered best practice anyway by marketers, so probably a good idea to do anyway. And then the third point here is you do need to clearly indicate who the sender is. And that one's a fairly obvious one in most situations. Why wouldn't you include the information on who the organization is or the individual is that's sending the email? But where this becomes perhaps a challenge is where, again, you're an agency or an independent person sending on behalf of an organization. So if you're doing that, or even if you're running an association and maybe you're sending on behalf of one of the members, again, it needs to clearly indicate who the sender is, no matter who the email address is that's being sent from. I hope that's clear. Does that make sense, Nick?
I was just surprised that it's not just the email, actually. That's why I went, that was interesting to know that.
Yeah, so it's just making sure that you know who the sender is. So you see this quite often. I'm a member of the Mississauga Board of Trade, and so they will often send messages out on behalf of partners or members, and it's coming from the Mississauga Board of Trade, but it's promoting another event or, you know, service or something like that. So that would be a situation where it might happen probably more frequently. The other situation might be if you're running you're running a business where you're doing marketing on behalf of your clients, you're sending out messages on their behalf. Again, you just need to make sure it's clear. In most cases, you're probably doing the activity but sending it out from the organization's email address anyway in that situation. But just a few scenarios where it might come into play. A couple of other considerations, and probably the first one is one that you might, well, you might be thinking, why should we care? Really, all this legislation is you know, it's kind of difficult, and is really the government going to come after me if I don't comply? But the legislation does come with some teeth. So if you are caught not complying, you can open your organization up to fines of up to $10 million per infraction for incorporated businesses or organizations, and up to $1 million per infraction for any sole proprietors. So you do need to get permission. Now, often that kind of scares people a little bit, but let me just reassure you, as long as you can prove that you tried to comply with the legislation, then the legislation says that will be considered. And but it does mean that you need to be trying to get permission from people, and you need to, as much as possible, track that. So you do need to care, in other words. And then the other thing that you want to be thinking about is when it comes to asking for express consent, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, but I just want to reiterate the point, you need to make sure that you're telling people that they're opting in to get your messages. So where might this come into play? Let's say that you are doing a trade show and you've got a display there and you've got a fishbowl, which is fine. You do need to make sure that whatever you have for signage doesn't just say win an iPad mini. It needs to say join our email list and get the chance to win an iPad mini, or join our email list and win an iPad mini. So just be careful that you're clearly indicating. I think people know when they throw their card in a fishbowl that they're going to start getting marketed to, but under the legislation you do need to kind of change up what you're doing and be clear with people that they are being added to a list. Now, I don't know if any of you are on the call are involved in a nonprofit or running a nonprofit organization. The truth is that this legislation still applies to nonprofit or charitable organizations, and that seems a little counterintuitive. A lot of people who work in these organizations say, well, we're not sending commercial messages, we're not for profit. But the truth is that under the legislation, under the definition of what is a commercial activity, any conduct that has some kind of a transactional nature, whether it's conducted for profit or not, does fall under this legislation. So where that might come into play is if a nonprofit or a charitable organization is maybe sending out a list of volunteer opportunities and asking people to come and be volunteers. That would be a transactional situation. Whether there's money exchanging hands or not, it's still considered a commercial activity. However, in the final regulations that came out last year, there is concession made for any activities that are fundraising oriented. So since most nonprofits do fundraising in almost every communication, it probably means that there's a little bit of a gray area there. So as long as there's a fundraising piece to the communication, then they do not need to have explicit permission, or they don't have to have permission, explicit or implied. However, having said all that, that's what the legislation says, but again, we don't really recommend it. It's really best to email or communicate with people who want to hear from you, who know who your organization is, and if you follow those best practices, you're going to get people on your list who actually want to hear from you, who are more likely to be engaged in your organization, and who will support you as opposed to just sort of annoying people along the way. So just want to think about that and take care of that. So let's move on and talk a little bit about why this legislation is important. Why trying to comply and trying to grow your list under the legislation is so important. But I do want to just pause for a second before I do that, and I want to reassure you. I think there's really one main message that as an online marketer you need to focus on, and that is that what this legislation is doing is enforcing what all of us who have been trying to be professional marketers have known all along. If you market to people who want to hear from you, you will be more successful. You will see far better results from your marketing efforts. You're going to get far better return on every dollar that you spend. So really, you do need to comply with the legislation. You need to understand what the legislation says, but a lot of people are running scared under the legislation, and to me, it really doesn't change anything. All it does is ask us to pull up our socks a little bit. The best practices of marketing have not changed at all. So the idea of turning strangers into friends and then into repeat customers and referral engines for your business, which is sort of the power of email marketing, that isn't really new. Seth Godin first noted that obtaining permission to market to your customers and supporters is critical to developing relationships, ones that become important and are missed if not maintained. Gail Goodman, our CEO at Constant Contact, recently came out with a book that talks about the importance of leveraging a great customer experience in your store, at one of your events, or other activities that you're doing, and turning that into a foundation for a great relationship. For asking that customer or supporter to allow you to provide the means to stay in touch with an email or a like on Facebook or a follow on Twitter. So today there's just more opportunities than ever to grow and extend your message and reach new customers. And there's a few tips and tricks that make it possible to maximize your results. And that's what I want to really focus on. Smart business owners know that they need to do what they can to build a permission-based list. And usually that includes an email list. And frankly, so should you. List building is critical for every business, for every sales rep, for every marketer. Whether you're running an online business, a brick-and-mortar business, or any kind of organization, you need a way to stay in touch with your prospects and your customers. And that's really about you finding a way to engage people. I talk a lot in seminars that I present at about the engagement marketing cycle. I'm going to walk you through it real quickly right now, but it's really just a principle around how do you how do you make sure that you are leveraging every connection that you make to help you find your next customer? If you think about how that works, think about your business. If you start there in the middle with the little door and the open sign, that's you, that's your business. And then if you move off to the right, every time someone comes in the door, whether it's they're picking up the phone or if they're walking, stepping right through your physical door, every time they come in the door, you've got to deliver some kind of wow experience for them. And we know this intuitively. We do what we can to build strong relationships with our customers, with our prospects. But from a marketing point of view, the reason why you need to do that is because if you can find a way to wow someone every single time they come into your organization, then you have the opportunity, the opportunity to leverage them for more business from either themselves or from their connections. And so what you need to be doing is when you deliver that wow experience, it's providing you an opportunity to entice people to stay in touch with you. It's an opportunity for you to ask them when they're saying, wow, that was just amazing. Thank you for what you've done for me, or what a great product. That's your opportunity to say, oh, I'm so glad you liked it. Now, why don't I add you to our email list so I can continue to tell you about new products that come out, or that I can tell you about what other people are doing with their products, or whatever it is that you're going to be offering them through your communication. So asking them to stay in touch. And the timing to do that is when people are already happy. They're already excited. It's harder to go back later and ask them. And then once you actually have them on your list or connected with you on social media, then it's your opportunity to engage with them, to interact with them in some way. And off that, then leverage social visibility, getting them to help you spread the message to their connections and then draw new prospects in the door. It's always that attraction principle. But it really starts with you delivering a great experience every single time someone walks in the door. So once you've enticed them to stay in touch, of course, as I said, you really do need to ask them to stay in touch with you. And hope is not a strategy. You can't just expect that people are going to go and find the opportunity to sign up to your list, or go and proactively find you on LinkedIn. Some will, but many won't. Getting them to come and follow you on Twitter, you need to tell them you got a Twitter page. You got to ask them to come and find you, or connect with them so they'll connect back. Hope is not a strategy. But the good news is that today people are more willing than ever to connect with you because they understand what you're asking for. But then again, they're also more picky. They're only really going to connect with organizations that they truly believe in, that they feel connected to. And there's all kinds of data that shows that people will choose to connect with an organization that they feel that connection with, or that they've experienced a great product or service. So they are willing, but they're also more choosy about who they connect with. And that's good news for many of us, because if we're delivering a great experience, then we know that we've got something valuable to give to people. So the one thing you do want to be thinking about is when you have somebody in your store or with your business, I think most of us are B2B on this call, so you're sitting in a boardroom with them and they're telling you, wow, what a great service you just delivered. That's the opportunity to entice them. But there may be other things that you can do to get them to sign up to your list. Here's an example of a small marketing agency, Solutions for Growth, that as part of signing up to his email list, he offers people a 7 steps for effective marketing, a little article. Now, would that entice me? Maybe not. Maybe you can come up with something even better than that, 5 tips for, hiring a great marketing agency in his case, or something like that. But once he has people that he has a connection with, he invites them to join the email list, and he says that as part of signing up to his email list, he'll send them 7 steps to effective marketing. Then he starts to interact with them in other ways. He gets them on the email list, and he encourages them to find him on Facebook, where he's pretty active, and he offers value on his social media sites as well. So it's just finding ways to interact with them in all the different ways that you're willing to engage them. And what are all the different ways to engage? Well, as I said, newsletters, events, sending out special offers and promotions, really any way that you can connect with people and interact with them, whether it's on email, on social, on mobile. It's finding ways to communicate on a continuous basis with people today. So what can you do to draw people in, to engage with them? Well, I would start by first of all thinking about what is it that you could offer in exchange for an email address. What might that be? We have a client at Constant Contact, completely unrelated probably to most of your businesses, but give it as an example. We have a client who runs a kitchenware store. So it's called Kitchen Outfitters. You know, all the high-end cookware and things like that. And so they have regular cooking classes, and they give away cookbooks every month. And so they've trained their staff who are also, you know, amateur chefs or people who love to cook. They've trained their staff to, you know, ask everybody who's in the store if they would like to be on the email list to hear about cooking classes. People who come into the store are typically people who like to cook, and then they also tell them that they're going to be entered in a draw for a cookbook each month. So, you know, it's just figuring out what is that thing that you could do that makes sense for your business. Most of us, if we're running B2B companies, we're probably going to be giving away an ebook or you know, something like that. Maybe a white paper. Maybe it's a free product that you do a draw for. I don't know. You need to think through what makes sense for your organization, and then you need to train anybody who works with your organization to be constantly asking people to join your list. And then, of course, you need to deliver on what you say you will. And consider over time asking your audience, finding out what people find valuable about the information that you're sending out. So don't just depend on your own ideas, but over time, once you've tried a few things, start to ask people, maybe just casually when you're out for lunch with them, what makes sense, what's really hitting you about the information that we're sharing. So what I want to do now is switch gears a little bit and talk about if you're trying to grow your list, how do you go about doing that under the legislation? So I'm going to just go fairly quickly through a lot of the actual collection strategies, the different things that you can do, and talk about how they comply with the legislation. So you want to start by building your list where you connect. You want to start off with some of the more obvious things you can do. First off, you're on the phone with people. You have voicemail messages. Every voicemail message that you have, everybody's answering voicemail, could indicate, are you on our email list? If not, go to our website and sign up. As you're on the phone with people, you could be asking them, are you on our list? Every live event that you're at, every meeting you go to, anytime that you're face-to-face with a customer or a prospect or a contact that you think might have value for your business, invite them to join your list. On your email signature, you could have a join our weekly tips email or whatever it is that you're offering and have people electronically opt in. You could, if you have a location that people come to, you could have a guest book that people fill out. So it's really thinking about what makes sense for your business and trying to figure out how you can incorporate some of these things. And then, of course, there's your online presence, which I'll talk more about in a minute. But the truth is that if you start asking people to join your list, whatever way you do it, approximately half of them are going to say yes. So if you just start asking people, you're going to see your list grow slowly but steadily, just by you having that process and asking people on a regular basis. Nick, were you going to say something?
No, I'm going to say something at the question. I've got a couple of questions here from people, so I'll catch you.
Sure. Okay. The other thing, of course, and fairly obviously, is on your website, you could ask people to join your list. So you can see a couple of examples here. Here's one: subscribe to our Central Ontario e-newsletter. Pretty straightforward request. These folks here, it's a ball hockey rink. They ask people to fill out a lot of information in order to join the list. And these folks, they do more of an incentive-driven. I don't know if you can read that. This is an online magazine for women. They've got a little pop-up window that says, join our email list today, and they're giving away prizes and that sort of thing. So lots of different ways that you can do that, but certainly, like I said earlier, electronic is a great way to get express consent, so getting people to opt in through your online join my mailing list form, or whatever you want to call it, your online subscription form, is a good thing to do. You can use QR codes. I know these have limited scope, but certainly among the business crowd, scan to join or using QR codes is certainly fairly common. Most people use QR codes to pull people to their website. I'm suggesting use a QR code and ask people to scan the code to join your email list. Again, another electronic opt-in opportunity. And if you do that, then you've got the opportunity to pull them to a mobile-enabled form, have them fill out their email address and possibly some other information, although I'd be careful about how much you ask, and get them to join the list that way. Of course, you can use your printed collateral, so whether it's your business card, your brochures, etc. Certainly having something on every piece of marketing material that talks about the fact that you offer a weekly tips, a monthly newsletter, whatever it is that you're offering. Just try and entice people to find you online and join your list. Any, like I mentioned earlier, voicemail, point of sale receipts, if you do that sort of thing, invoices, every customer interaction that you have is an opportunity for you to invite people to join your list. Of course, your social media is important in trying to drive people to participate with you, to engage with you, and to be part of your list. So one of the things you can do is when you're sending out email campaigns, you can share those emails on your social sites, whatever they are. And you can encourage other people to share as well, just by adding a share bar at the top of your messages. But you can also use your social media sites to draw people to your email list. So here's an example, Island Natural Markets in BC. They are pulling people from their Facebook page to a Facebook app that lets people automatically join the email list. So again, doing that just straightforwardly, would you like to be on our list? And the other thing you see people doing a lot is some sort of, let me back up there for a second, some sort of a Facebook campaign, maybe a special offer. So I've seen people offering, again, a white paper or an e-book for anybody who goes and joins the email list through the Facebook page. I've seen them, they have a free download if you join the email list. I've also seen sweepstakes or contests where you join the email list and you're entered into this contest. Again, a way to pull people from social to email. I mentioned the fishbowl earlier. I'm going to just reiterate again that if you do that, you need to make sure that you follow the parameters of the Canada anti-spam legislation and make sure that you're clearly indicating what people are joining. So you can't just have the fishbowl there that says, win a whatever. You got to make sure that you're indicating that they're going to be added to your email list. I wanted to highlight a couple of other apps for you. If you're trying to build your list and you're going to try and do that in an aggressive way, then there's a few tools that can help you. The first is Captricity, which is an online tool which extracts contact information from your forms or business cards into an electronic format that then can be pulled into Constant Contact or whatever software you use. So Constant Contact has an integration with Captricity, but you could just use Captricity independent of Constant Contact and then pull that as an Excel list and then pull it into your email system. Contact Capture, this is very specific to Constant Contact. It's an app that we offer to all of our customers, which lets you, if you're offline, add people electronically into like a desktop app or an offline app, and then once you're online, it'll automatically pull that data into your list on Constant Contact software. So that's specific to Constant Contact users. And then iCapture, also limited to Constant Contact users. iCapture is an iPad app, which does the same thing. If you're at a trade show or something, you can have people fill out their information rather than a paper ballot, have them fill it out on iPads using the iCapture app for iPad or Android devices. So those are a few electronic tools. There's lots of different things out there. So if you're looking for list building tools, you simply need to Google them, list building apps, and you'll see lots of different things pop up. But those are a few ideas of things that you can use. I wanted to talk a little bit about the whole issue of renting versus owning lists. And if you think about social media specifically, a lot of people I've heard say, well, I guess now that Canada anti-spam legislation is coming into play, it just makes social media where we really need to focus. And I'm not disagreeing with that. I do think social media is huge, and we should be trying to figure out a way to leverage it for our businesses and really make it draw new business opportunities for us. Some people are figuring that out, some are struggling. But at the end of the day, I don't think that you can depend exclusively on social media. I still think that you need to be putting work and effort into building a subscription-based list. And while social media appears to be that way, there is some limits around what's possible on it. And you don't really own the list of people who are connected with you on Facebook, on Twitter, etc. If Twitter or LinkedIn or Facebook changed their algorithm or went away, you lose that list. You can't take it with you in most cases. So you certainly need to be thinking about how can you leverage the power of social media and then draw people to something that you actually own. And if there is no value that you're offering, people are going to unsubscribe anyway. So the fact is you need to figure out how do you get people to really come and be part of your community where you own that list, where it's an asset for your business that you can sell along with your business should you choose to exit out. The other thing I want to talk about around the whole renting versus owning is the actual issue of renting lists. And under the legislation, you can still rent email lists. You can rent the use of a list, but you do need to be certain that that list is permission-based, that list, the list company has gotten permission to email those people and for their customers to email those people. I would suggest to you that the legislation may say that as long as the permission is there that you can email a rented list. But again, going back to a best practice of marketing, the truth is these people really don't know who you are. They really are not expecting anything from you, and therefore you really, in my mind as a marketer, do not have permission to email them. Now there may be situations where you're starting out where you may need to try to do something, but I would think very carefully around what you're going to do before you do that, and maybe look at alternatives. Is there a way you could piggyback on someone else's list? Could you spend the money that you would spend by renting a list to go and do some co-marketing with a trade magazine or an online magazine that focuses on the market you're trying to reach? Think about other alternatives before you go out and rent an email list that really isn't, in the truest marketing sense, giving you permission to be sending them. So what are a few things you can do today around getting permission for new people? Certainly you want to be thinking about a couple of different ways that you can be collecting email addresses from anybody who's new and start to put that into place and test what works. And then you also want to look at the language that you use when you're asking for email addresses and other contact information. And then, of course, take a look at your emails and make sure that you're complying with some of the parameters of the Canada anti-spam legislation. So let's jump into the question time now.
Can I interject just here?
Of course.
Lisa, I've got a couple of questions here for you.
Sure, great.
From Andrea, she asked if you could give an example of what a reminder of why you're getting the email would be.
Oh, very often you see at the top of an email, it'll say something like, you're receiving this message because you subscribed to our Hints and Tips newsletter, or something like that. So that would be an example.
Okay. And from Jennifer, she asks, what should she be telling her U.S. clients in terms of them mailing to their Canadian subscribers once this law is in place?
Well, this legislation applies to any organization that is marketing to Canadians or marketing from a Canadian-based company to other people. So for your U.S. clients, who are marketing to people in Canada, this legislation applies. They need to be getting permission from everyone on their list. They can get express consent or they can get implied consent. I strongly recommend express because then you don't have the whole time limit issue. But certainly they do need to get permission.
Thank you.
The question, of course, becomes how is the government going to enforce this for U.S.-based companies? I don't know. But if they want to be professional, if they want to be seen as professional with Canadians, then they need to be looking at how they comply, how they can comply.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Sorry, can I just jump in before you ask me another question? Because I realize as I'm talking that I did not, while I was talking about the actual legislation, there were a couple things I needed to say. That is that one of those things is that there is a grace period. So the legislation goes into effect on July 1st, but there is a grace period built into the legislation that gives you a little time to kind of pull your socks up and comply. And so, that grace period is 3 years where they're apparently not going to take any action. But the fact is that there's a certain amount of public pressure because there's been so much information, particularly in the business community. So if you market to other businesses, there's certainly a lot of knowledge about the legislation. So while the legislation may say that you've got a 3-year grace period, I would suggest that sometime in the next 6 to 12 months you need to have your socks all pulled up.
Okay, what was okay, that's a good point, thank you. Can I throw another question your way?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, and then I'll let you. Charmaine asks, if you're sending out a newsletter on behalf of a client and it is being sent from their system, do I have to mention that it is also coming from my company?
Well, if you are going in on their behalf and you're using their system, it's a bit of a gray area. I'm not a lawyer. I've heard mixed comments on this from lawyers. So I've heard that you need to make sure that somewhere in the message that it indicates, perhaps in fine print, that you created and sent that on behalf of your clients. But then I've also heard, well, if it's just you as a subcontractor or as a agent on behalf of your client is going into their software, sending from their email, their newsletter, then it's a non-issue. So it's hard to say. I don't know the answer.
So if she's really concerned, she should talk to a lawyer.
Probably, yes. Yeah. I'd recommend that for anybody who's concerned.
Yes, that's a good point.
Of course, then you come out of your lawyer scratching your head and going, I didn't do anything.
Actually, I've been very surprised at the number of sort of groups that have lawyers commenting on this and advising us to just ignore it, which I find rather strange, that a lawyer is advising us to break the law.
It's true. It's interesting.
Please continue.
Let me just reiterate again, though. This is an opportunity for you to just clean up what you're already doing as a professional marketer.
That's a very good point.
If you have been trying to be professional and send to people who you have some kind of relationship with, or if you haven't been going out and purposely spamming people, then yes, you need to take a look at what you're doing and try to make sure you're complying. But if you haven't been intentionally spamming people, then I don't think you have a lot to worry about. I think it's just an opportunity for you to look at your business like we should every once in a while and say, what can we do better?
And get a very quality list.
Make sure you've got a quality list, which in turn will produce better results for you anyway.
Very good point.
Better to have a list that is 60% of the size of your original list that is full of people who are going to buy from you, because at the end of the day, you're going to get better results. And then from there, grow the list. I'm not suggesting that you suddenly need to take your list down to 60%, but let's just say in cleaning it up, you ended up with people who did drop off your list. I still think that you are better off having a list of people who want to hear from you.
Amen. Okay, that's my question so far.
Okay, so there's a few questions that come up quite a bit in the seminars that I do. The first is, if I have been emailing my contacts for years do I need to reconfirm consent? And so this is probably one of the touchiest issues around the legislation. A lot of people saying, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to turf my list entirely and start over, and disappointment around that, of course. And the truth is that you do not need to turf your list. For one thing, there's a grandfather period. For another thing, I would suspect that most of the people on your list you have implied consent from. So you are already okay for 2 years. However, you should be doing what you can to reconfirm consent, because just because someone's on your list doesn't mean that they have opted into your list. If they haven't unsubscribed, that's not necessarily an opt-in. So what you probably should be doing is looking at what is the best way for me to go back and either confirm that I have expressed consent, or just go back and make sure that I, at some point in the next, I'd say 6 to 12 months, make sure that I have consent, express consent from everybody on the list, so that I can do away with the time limit of implied consent. And so a few things you could do. You're certainly seeing a whole lot more people sending out messages right now as we head up to July 1st that say something like, are you in or are you out? Click here to reconfirm your opt-in. And certainly that is okay up until July 1st, although you could argue that you're kind of spamming people. The one thing that if you are going to send out a message like that, I would be very, very careful about how you word that message. Because if you word it like, click here if you want to continue getting our messages, then if they don't click here and they don't re-opt in, then as a professional, you probably shouldn't continue emailing them, because you've said, click here if you want to keep getting our messages. So you might want to make, if you're going to do something like that, you might want to make the language a little bit more, we're just trying to make sure that everybody on our list is confirming their subscription, so, we'd love it if you'd click here, kind of thing. So just be careful about the wording of that. Hopefully, I'm sure there's better ways of saying it than I just came up with off the top of my head. But you want to try and reconfirm consent. I've been talking to a lot of our customers in Canada about what they're doing. I had a conversation just last week with a woman who said she has just under 1,000 people on her list, and she started about 6 weeks ago calling everyone on the list to reconfirm their consent orally, and then tracking that permission in her database. And I said, wow, that's a big job. And she said, I started out thinking, man, this is a pain in the butt. And she goes, now I'm excited about it. I do a few every day. She goes, I have already landed $100,000 in business in 6 weeks just from picking up the phone and calling my customers. So maybe that's a good way to reconfirm your list. I don't know. You need to be thinking about what makes sense for your business. But certainly you do need to try to reconfirm consent. The other thing is sometimes people ask me if I have permission through social media, as in someone has liked my page, followed me on Twitter, or connected with me on LinkedIn, is that not a way of them saying, yes, I want to hear from you? So it could act as express consent for email as well. And under the legislation, the answer to that is no. Social media communications are considered electronic messages. They are subject to the law, but that is a separate type of permission from email. You need to get permission from both. I mean, the great thing about social media is permission is kind of built in already. Somebody has to follow you or like you to hear from you on social media. You can spam people, but they have to have connected with you in some way anyway. So anyway, the answer to this question is no. If they've liked or followed or connected with you on other social media, that does not give you express consent to email them as well. And then the third question, and this is really just me reiterating a point that I've already made, opt-ins with proper express consent do not have an expiration date. So if you have gotten express or explicit consent, either orally, in writing, or electronically, as long as you have a record of that, then that is express consent. It does not expire. So it's the best type of consent, in other words. So those are the common questions. Are there any others that people have? Is there anything else I can answer for you?
One common one that's coming through from a number of people is, this is all very well and good, but how do we actually keep a record of the fact that someone has given us express permission?
Yeah, it can just be a field in your database. I know for our customers at Constant Contact, we've just advised people to use one of the user-defined fields at this point, although we're about to make changes in our system that will actually add a required field. But yeah, for now, just use a user-defined field and set it up and add notes about your permission.
So what you'd have to actually put in, yes, they wrote to us or they signed in for the newsletter.
Yeah, just a quick note. You could have some kind of code so it's quick to enter, you know, oral, ballot, you know, trade show, and then the date.
And the date. Okay, thank you.
I know some of your clients, Nick, are Constant Contact customers, so do you want to say that by June 30th, we actually have some changes coming in the system that are going to, for Canadian customers, have a field that they're required to fill out, or if they're pulling a list in, they need to indicate what that field should say.
Oh, related to this? That field will be? Oh, okay, thank you. We will let them know. Thank you. Okay, that's the question so far. And what about when they give you, oh no, we've done that one. Okay. Okay, that's the questions I got here.
Great. Well, then let's just wrap with a few things that maybe people need to be thinking about. Of course, you need to take a look at your current list and figure out whether you have applied or expressed consent, and if you're not certain, then maybe over the next several months you need to make sure that you're reconfirming consent in some way. And then, of course, review your emails and see if there's anything you need to do to comply. Make sure that you've got your unsubscribe option there for people. You know, make sure that the language of those emails, you know, from the permission reminder to, you know, who that message is coming from, complies with the anti-spam legislation as well. And then if you're looking for a few ideas, a few more ideas, a few tips on how to grow your list, we have an online resource, basically a white paper of a ton of different ideas for growing your contact list, so you're certainly welcome to go and download that. I know, Nick, you're going to share these slides, so you'll have that link in case you're trying to jot it down real quickly. And then if you're thinking that maybe it's time for you to get an email marketing system, I'd love if you consider Constant Contact. We offer a free 60-day trial for you, which you're certainly welcome to try out. And Nick, maybe you can include that link in your email as well,
yes.
If someone wants to sign up for a trial. And then finally, if you're looking to learn more, Constant Contact offers a number of live seminars and workshops within the Ontario area and across Eastern Canada, actually, but we offer a number of seminars and workshops, and over the next 6 to 8 weeks, we have a lot of CASL activities going on. In fact, next Tuesday, we've got a big one-day conference on, you know, improving your email activity, and a big chunk of that is around CASL. So certainly lots of resources that we offer around this. So without further ado, Nick, I'll send it back to you.
And thank you very much, Lisa, for taking the time to share this with us. If anyone has other questions that we didn't cover in the webinar, please feel free to pass them to me. It's nick@yourplanningpartners.com, and I will pass them on to Lisa. And as she said, we are going to be sharing the slides and a recording of this webinar, and we will be sending them to all the registrants. But with no further ado, it's 9 o'clock. Thank you again for joining us, everyone.